That gray afternoon in Dalkey, the sea wind pushed the salt spray against the stone walls of Cormac Tierney's mansion. The millionaire whom everyone knew, but no one dared greet. His steel gray eyes swept through the corridors, and the servants lowered their heads as if mere eye contact were a crime. The only sound to be heard was the sharp echo of his shoes against the cold marble floors. Cormac Tierney wasn't just wealthy, he was untouchable. At 68, his silver hair was always perfectly combed back, never a strand out of place. His tall, angular frame moved through the mansion like a shadow of authority. Wrapped in his tailored charcoal suit that seemed to absorb all warmth from the room, the staff had learned long ago that silence was their safeguard. Mrs. Murphy, the head housekeeper, would press her lips into a thin line whenever he passed, whilst the gardener would find urgent tasks that required him to face away from the main path. But wealth, they say, cannot buy back time, nor can it silence the ghosts that linger in grand houses built on old sorrows. The mansion itself seemed to breathe with unspoken secrets. Each room held shadows of conversations never finished, of laughter that had died too young. The walls were adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, all bearing the same cold blue eyes that Cormac had inherited. Yet there was one portrait that had been turned to face the wall, a small frame near the grand staircase that no one was ever permitted to touch. On this particular afternoon, the household moved through its routine with the precision of a Swiss clock. Louisa Larkin, the cleaner, worked with quiet efficiency, her 42 years etched in the firm lines of her weathered hands. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in its usual simple knot, and her navy cleaning uniform moved soundlessly as she polished the ancient oak panels. She'd learned the rules quickly when she'd started working here 3 years ago. Invisible work, invisible presence, invisible existence. Behind her, like a small ray of sunshine in the gray mansion, 8-year-old Sophia played quietly in the corner. The child's light brown hair fell in gentle waves around her shoulders, and her bright eyes took in everything with the wonder that only children possess. She wore a simple woolen dress handed down from cousins paired with thick tights, and worn little boots that had seen many Dublin winters. Then, in the midst of that reverent silence, something extraordinary happened. A small hand appeared, offering him a biscuit broken in two. For an instant, the world seemed to stop. Sophia Larkin, daughter of the house cleaner, raised her innocent eyes, completely unaware of the audacity of her gesture. Behind her, her mother, Louisa, felt her heart stop, knowing that this act of childhood mischief could cost her the job that kept a roof over their heads. The shock rippled through the entire room. The housekeeper pressed her lips together even tighter. The other staff members seemed to forget how to breathe. Who would dare break through Cormac Tierney? A wall of ice The biscuit was homemade, humble, crumbling slightly at the edges where Sophia's small fingers had carefully broken it to share. It was the kind of simple oatmeal biscuit that Irish grandmothers had been making for generations. Nothing fancy, nothing that would ever grace the china of Cormac's formal dining room. But Cormac accepted the biscuit. His fingers trembled slightly before bringing it to his mouth. The sound of the crunch broke through the tension, and with it, a memory buried deep in time surfaced like a ghost from the depths. A whisper escaped his lips, a word in Irish, barely audible. Ethan. The biscuit fell from his hand, and with it, a crystal glass that shattered against the floor, the sound echoing through the mansion like a gunshot. Nobody understood who Ethan was, but Sophia, still smiling with innocent joy, repeated the forbidden name quietly. Ethan. What a pretty name. The mansion whispered like a confessional. Since the incident with the biscuit, no one dared mention the strange word that the millionaire had let slip. Louisa tried to forget, but she noticed something impossible. Sophia repeated Ethan as if it were an ancient song, humming it between her games. How could a child have access to a name buried for decades? The days that followed were filled with an uncomfortable tension that seemed to seep into the very walls of the Dalkey mansion. Cormac moved through his daily routine with even more rigidity than usual. If such a thing were possible, his silver hair remained perfectly in place, his charcoal suits pressed to perfection. But there was something different in his steel-gray eyes, a haunted quality that the staff began to notice, though none dared speak of it. Mrs. Murphy, the head housekeeper, found herself watching Sophia with increasing unease. The child continued her innocent play, but that cursed name would slip from her lips at the most unexpected moments. While arranging flowers, Sophia might hum a little tune and end it with Ethan. While helping her mother fold laundry, she might create little stories about a character named Ethan. It was as if the word had taken root in her young mind and was flowering into something that made the adults around her deeply uncomfortable. One evening, whilst collecting sheets from the upper floor, Louisa overheard two staff members whispering in the narrow servants' corridor. The gas lamps cast long shadows on the walls, and their voices carried that particular quality that gossip takes on in grand houses hushed, but urgent, fearful, but hungry for scandal. I remember hearing whispers years ago, said Mary, one of the kitchen maids, her Dublin accent thick with nervousness. Something about Cormac Tierney having had a sister called Ethan, dead tragically in the 70s. Some sort of accident, they said, but the family swept it all under the carpet, proper-like. The other maid, young Bridget from Cork, crossed herself quickly, sweet mother of God. And the child keeps saying that name like she knows something we don't. Gives me the chills. It does. The weight of this revelation pressed down on Louisa's chest like a stone. Was it coincidence? Or had her daughter somehow unearthed the secret that everyone feared to pronounce? She found herself watching Sophia more carefully, noting how the child seemed drawn to certain parts of the house, particularly the area near the grand staircase, where that one portrait remained turned to face the wall. But it was the following morning, during breakfast in the mansion's formal dining room, when everything truly came undone. Lady Margaret Fitzgerald, an old friend of the Tierney family and a regular guest for morning tea, was sampling one of the homemade biscuits that Sophia had innocently placed on the serving tray. The morning light streamed through the tall windows, catching the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. The conversation had been the usual refined chatter about weather and local affairs, when Lady Margaret suddenly paused, the biscuit halfway to her lips. With a nervous smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, she commented aloud, "But this is exactly the biscuit that Ethan used to love eating as a child. The very same recipe her old nanny used to make. I'd recognize that particular blend of oats and honey anywhere." The dining room froze, as if winter had suddenly descended. Every person in the room, from Cormac seated at the head of the mahogany table to the serving staff stationed silently along the walls, felt the temperature drop several degrees. Lady Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she set down the biscuit, realizing too late that she had spoken something that should have remained buried. Cormac rose from his chair abruptly, the heavy wooden legs scraping against the polished floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. His face had gone pale as the Irish mist, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "Everyone out," he commanded, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. Now, the staff scattered like leaves in an autumn wind, but Louisa found herself rooted to the spot, her hand instinctively reaching for Sophia's shoulder. The child stood perfectly still, her innocent eyes wide, but unafraid, as if she sensed something important was happening, but couldn't quite grasp its significance. When the room had emptied of all but the three of them, Cormac moved closer to Louisa with the measured steps of a predator. His tall frame cast a shadow over her smaller form, and she could smell the expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask something else, something like old grief, like secrets kept too long in dark places. He leaned down until his face was level with hers, his steel-gray eyes boring into her brown ones with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. "Who taught her that recipe?" he whispered, his voice rough with emotions he'd spent decades learning to suppress. The silence of Dalkey was no longer sufficient to hide old wounds. At the end of that week, Cormac summoned Louisa and Sophia to his study and, with a tone that mixed harshness and pleading, invited them to spend the weekend at his cottage in the Wicklow Mountains. The invitation sounded like a sentence. To refuse would be an affront. To accept seemed like a trap. The study itself was a fortress of masculinity and power. Dark oak panels lined the walls, interrupted only by shelves of leather-bound books that looked as though they hadn't been opened in decades. Behind Cormac's massive mahogany desk hung a portrait of his father, a stern man, with the same steel-gray eyes and an expression that suggested he'd never smiled in his entire life. The heavy burgundy curtains were drawn partially closed, casting the room in perpetual twilight eve. And during the brightest Dublin afternoon, Louisa hesitated, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. Why would a man who had never allowed even a glance now dare to open the doors to his privacy? She feared falling into the trap of gossip that would surely follow, the cleaner taking advantage of her employer. The whispers would spread through Dalkey like wildfire, reaching every pub and shop, every church gathering and market day conversation. Her reputation, already precarious as a single mother working in service, would be destroyed completely. But Sophia, with the innocence that never calculates consequences, squeezed her mother's hand and answered for both of them, "We'll go." Louisa's heart crumbled like old parchment. The journey to Wicklow took them through some of Ireland's most breathtaking countryside. As Cormac's black Mercedes wound through narrow roads bordered by ancient stone walls, Sophia pressed her face to the window, watching sheep dotting the emerald hillsides like scattered clouds. The mountains rose around them like sleeping giants, their peaks shrouded in mist that seemed to hold secrets from centuries past. Cormac drove in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel with unnecessary force. Occasionally, Louisa would catch glimpses of his face in the rearview mirror, the tight set of his jaw, the way his eyes would dart to Sophia's reflection as if he were seeing a ghost. The silence in the car was different from the oppressive quiet of the mansion. This felt charged with anticipation, like the air before a thunderstorm. The cottage, when they finally reached it, was nothing like the grand mansion in Dalkey, built of local stone and nestled into a fold of the mountains. It seemed to have grown from the landscape itself. Ivy covered much of the exterior walls, and wild roses had claimed the garden, creating a tangle of beauty and neglect that spoke of years without proper attention. It was the kind of place that whispered of simpler times, of family gatherings, and children's laughter, things that seemed alien to the Cormac Tierney that Louisa knew inside. The atmosphere was completely different from the mansion, where Dalkey was all marble and crystal, cold grandeur, and intimidating spaces. The cottage felt lived in, human. There were photographs on the walls, though many were turned face down or covered with cloth. Books lay scattered on tables, with their spines cracked from actual reading. A fire had been laid in the stone hearth, ready to be lit, and the furniture was comfortable rather than imposing. It was Sophia who first noticed the small wooden box sitting on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. The box itself was unremarkable simple oak, probably handmade, with brass hinges that had tarnished with age. But something about it drew the child like a magnet. While Louisa was still taking in the strange domesticity of the cottage, and Cormac was staring out the window at the mist-covered mountains, Sophia had already climbed onto a chair to reach the box. "Sophia, no," Louisa called out, but it was too late. The lid opened with a soft creak, and inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper that seemed to whisper as it was unfolded, lay a pair of tiny baby shoes. They were beautifully crafted, with delicate embroidery around the edges and satin ribbons that had faded from blue to gray. They looked as though they had never been worn, preserved like relics in this mountain sanctuary. Louisa rushed to close the box immediately, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment at her daughter's intrusion into such obviously private matters. But Cormac was already behind them, moving with surprising silence for such a large man. When she turned to face him, expecting anger or harsh words, she instead saw something that stopped her cold. Tears, not the dramatic sobs of theatrical grief, but the rare, precious tears of a man who had forgotten how to cry properly. They tracked slowly down his weathered cheeks, catching the light from the cottage windows like liquid silver. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. She would have been Sophia's age. The revelation hung in the air like thunder. The daughter that Cormac had lost before she could even be born, fruit of a marriage that had shipwrecked in tragedy, was the secret that had transformed him into living stone. But what shocked Louisa most was realizing that the tiny shoes were identical to a pair that her own mother, many years before, had crafted to sell at local fairs. The cottage seemed to exhale old sorrows as this truth settled over them. Louisa found herself studying Cormac's face, seeing for the first time the man beneath the millionaire's mask. His steel-gray hair, usually so perfectly styled, had become disheveled during their journey, making him look more human, more vulnerable. The expensive clothes seemed out of place here in this simple cottage, as if he were playing dress-up in someone else's life, while she tried to piece together fragments of understanding. An envelope slipped from inside the box, falling to the cottage floor with a whisper. The paper was aged, yellowed at the edges, and bore a date written in faded ink, Christmas 1977. Sophia, ever curious and unaware of the weight of adult secrets, snatched up the envelope before either adult could react and ran to the old cassette player that sat in the corner of the main room. The player itself was a relic from another era, one of those boxy portable models that had been popular in the late 70s. Its silver finish had tarnished, and one of the speakers was held together with electrical tape. But it had the solid construction of appliances made to last. Sophia had seen similar devices at her grandmother's house and knew instinctively how to operate it. She pressed the play button with the confidence of a child who believes all discoveries are meant to be shared. A woman's voice, soft and trembling with emotion, filled the cottage. The accent was unmistakably Irish, with the refined pronunciation of someone educated, but the warmth of someone deeply loved. The voice spoke with the intimacy of family, addressing someone who clearly meant the world to the speaker. Cormac, Moster, the voice began, using the Irish endearment that meant my treasure. I know you'll be listening to this someday, when I'm not here to say these words myself. I want you to know that none of this was your fault. You were the best big brother a girl could have asked for. And I need you to remember that when the guilt tries to swallow you whole. The voice paused, and in the background, they could hear the faint sound of Christmas music playing somewhere in the distance, along with muffled voices of what sounded like a family gathering. It was Ethan Tierney, the forgotten sister, calling Cormac by a pet name that only family would know, Mo Croybeag. My little heart, a name that spoke of childhood intimacy and sibling bonds that had been severed too soon. Sophia, not understanding the gravity of what she was hearing, but enchanted by the musical quality of the Irish words, repeated the endearment aloud. Mo Croybeag. What a lovely sound. Cormac's face went ashen as winter frost. The blood seemed to drain from his features entirely, leaving him looking like a man who had seen his own ghost. He lunged forward and tore the cassette from the player, crushing it in his hands as if he could suffocate the ghost it contained. The plastic cracked, and the tape spilled out like brown entrails, but it was far too late to unsay what had been heard. But damage beyond repair had already been done. Louisa had caught enough of the recording to understand that there were deeper currents, here a history of broken promises and family scars that went far beyond a simple biscuit recipe. The way Ethan had spoken suggested knowledge of impending tragedy, as if she had known her time was running short. There was forgiveness in her voice, but also a terrible sadness that spoke of family failures and systems that had let her down when she needed them most. The cottage fell into a silence that seemed to echo with the ghosts of words just spoken. Outside, the wick-low mist pressed against the windows like curious spirits trying to peer inside. Cormac stood with the destroyed cassette in his hands, his chest rising and falling as if he had just run a great distance. When he finally looked up at Louisa, his eyes held a fever that she had never seen before. Desperate, haunted, but also strangely relieved. as if a wound that had festered for decades was finally being exposed to air and light. "Someone made her come back," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "And it wasn't you who brought her. I need to know who did this. I need to know who else knows our family's secrets." Dalkey simmered with whispers. The neighbors gossiped about the scandal of seeing the cleaner and her daughter staying at Cormac Tierney's cottage for the elite. This wasn't generosity, but madness. One morning, Louisa was approached at the local market. A woman insinuated that she was hooking her employer. Louisa's blood boiled, but her survival instinct forced her to remain silent. The Dalkey market had always been more than just a place to buy fresh fish and vegetables. It was the beating heart of local gossip, where reputations were made and destroyed over morning tea and fresh scones. The cobblestone square, dating back centuries, had witnessed countless dramas played out between its ancient walls. Today, those walls seemed to press closer as Louisa made her way between the stalls, feeling as following her every movement. Mrs. Catherine O'Brien, wife of the local bank manager and self-appointed guardian of Dalkey's moral standards, approached with the predatory smile of a woman who had found fresh meat for the gossip mill. Her perfectly coiffed gray hair didn't move an inch in the sea breeze, held in place by enough hairspray to weather a hurricane. Her tweed suit was expensive, but matronly, designed to project respectability rather than beauty. Well, Louisa Larkin," she said, her Dublin accent polished, but carrying an unmistakable edge of malice. "Quite the weekend getaway you've had, I hear. Moving up in the world, are we? Though I suppose there are traditional ways that working women better their circumstances." The implication hung in the salt air like poison. Louisa felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to focus on selecting potatoes with steady hands. She had learned long ago that responding to such provocations only fed the flames of scandal. But inside, her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. "Nothing to say for yourself, Mrs. O'Brien pressed, clearly disappointed by the lack of reaction. "Well, I suppose actions speak louder than words, don't they? And the whole town is certainly talking about your actions." That same afternoon, back at the mansion, an even more devastating blow struck. Sophia was playing innocently with Mary, one of the younger maids, in the servants' hall, a cheerful room below stairs, where the staff took their meals and brief moments of rest. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow, and afternoon sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting everything in a golden glow that should have felt warm and safe. But childhood innocence has a way of detonating adult secrets. "Mr. Cormac said I remind him of the daughter he lost," Sophia announced brightly whilst arranging her small collection of wooden toys. "He said she would have been my age, and that she probably would have liked the same games I do. Isn't that nice? Maybe we could have been friends if she was still alive. The room fell silent, as if someone had sucked all the air from it. Mary's face went white as fresh milk, and the teacup in her hand began to rattle against its saucer. The other staff members, who had been chatting quietly around the long wooden table, suddenly found urgent tasks that required their immediate attention, but not before exchanging meaningful glances. Loaded with scandal and speculation, within minutes, the information spread through the mansion, like wildfire jumping from roof to roof. By evening, it had reached the ears of distant Tierney relatives who had maintained careful distance from Cormac for decades, content to live off the family name whilst avoiding its more complicated realities. Phone calls were made to Dublin drawing rooms and Cork country houses. Old alliances were questioned, and new strategies were discussed in hushed tones over crystal decanters of aged whiskey. The weight of being watched, judged, and discussed pressed down on Louisa like a physical force. Every glance from the other staff seemed loaded with judgment. Every whispered conversation that stopped when she entered a room felt like an indictment. She found herself questioning every decision, every word, every moment of kindness that Cormac had shown toward Sophia. That night, as she was finishing her duties in the mansion's vast kitchen, something slipped under the service Dora white envelope that seemed to glow against the dark stone floor. Her name was written on it in handwriting that trembled with age or emotion, and inside was a single piece of paper with an address in Dublin 8, one of the city's older, more working-class neighborhoods. The message was brief and mysterious. If you want the truth about Ethan, come alone. Tomorrow, 3 o'clock. Come to the back entrance. But as Louisa lifted her eyes from the letter, her heart nearly stopped. Cormac was standing in the kitchen doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the light from the corridor. His steel-gray eyes were fixed on the letter in her hands, and his expression suggested that he had been expecting this moment, that he, too, knew exactly what that letter contained. So, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of buried secrets, "They've finally decided to make contact." In the heart of Dublin 8, the narrow streets echoed with stories that weren't told in public. Louisa, driven by courage and fear in equal measure, found an elderly woman who kept a box of documents from decades past. In it, medical records and old letters revealed that Ethan Tierney hadn't died by accident, as everyone believed, but from family negligence covered up in silence. The address led to a terraced house that had seen better days, its brick facade darkened by decades of Dublin soot and rain. The neighborhood itself told stories of working-class families who had called these streets home for generations, people who knew how to keep secrets. but also when those secrets needed to come to light. Number 47 sat between a corner shop that had been boarded up for years and a house where lace curtains twitched whenever strangers approached. Mrs. Bridget Connolly answered the door before Louisa had even finished knocking. She was a woman in her 80s, with silver hair that caught the afternoon light and eyes that held the sharp intelligence of someone who had seen too much of the world's cruelties to be shocked by anything new. Her cardigan was handwear upon in traditional Irish patterns, and her house smelled of turf fires and strong tea, the scent of authentic Ireland that tourists never quite experienced. "You'll be Louisa Larkin," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "I've been expecting you for years, though I thought it might be him who came first. Come in, child. We've much to discuss." The sitting room was small, but immaculately kept, with photographs covering every available surface, family portraits spanning decades, communion pictures, wedding photos yellowed with age. But it was the wooden box on the central table that drew Louisa's attention. It looked official, like something that might have belonged to a solicitor or doctor, with brass corners and a lock that had long since been broken. "I was a midwife in those days, Mrs. Connolly explained as she prepared tea with the ritualistic precision of someone for whom hospitality was a sacred duty. Worked with the best families in Dublin, including the Tierneys. Sweet Mary, Mother of God, the things I saw in those grand houses." The documents inside the box told a story that made Louisa's hands shake as she read. Medical records from 1977 detailed a difficult pregnancy, complications that required immediate hospital care, and a family's decision to prioritize reputation over medical necessity. Letters between doctors spoke of unfortunate delays and family interference with medical recommendations. Most damning of all was a coroner's report that had been altered, with the original cause of death crossed out and replaced with something more palatable to public consumption. Ethan Tierney hadn't died in a car accident, as the official family story claimed. She had died from complications during childbirth, complications that could have been prevented if the family had allowed her to be taken to hospital. Instead of insisting that everything be handled discreetly at home, the baby, a daughter, had died with her. The crushing weight of this revelation settled over Cormac when he read those pages later that evening. He had returned to the mansion to find Louisa waiting in his study, the documents spread across his mahogany desk like evidence in a trial. His hands trembled as he read his own father's signature on letters that had sealed his sister's fate, and his own signature on documents that had helped maintain the cover-up. For decades, he had carried this guilt like a millstone around his neck, believing himself complicit in a system that valued appearances over lives. The family had made him promise to never speak of what had really happened, threatening to disinherit him and destroy his future if he ever revealed the truth. He had been young then, barely 25, and he had chosen financial security over moral courage. But it was Sophia's innocent presence that finally broke the dam of his resistance. As she played quietly in the corner of the study, arranging her wooden toys and humming the Irish tune she had somehow learned, she looked up and pointed to one of the old letters with the guileless curiosity of childhood. "What's this word here?" she asked, her finger tracing over the faded ink. "Mo Croibig. That's what the lady on the tape called you. That means you were loved, doesn't it?" The words hit Cormac like physical blows. Ethan had loved him, had trusted him to be better than their father, and he had failed her completely. But perhaps it wasn't too late to honor her memory in a way that mattered. That night, by candlelight in his study, Cormac signed a document of donation, designating a significant portion of his fortune to establish a maternity hospital in Galway in Ethan's name. But this gesture wasn't merely philanthropic, it was a public rupture with the family that had spent decades burying truths in favor of maintaining their pristine reputation. The document would become public record, and with it, questions would inevitably arise about why a man would donate millions to a cause so specific, unless it held personal meaning. The Tierney family secret would finally be exposed to the light, and there would be consequences. As Cormac set down his fountain pen and looked at his signature still wet on the page, the study door burst open. Mrs. Murphy, the head housekeeper, stood there with her face flushed and her usual composure completely shattered. "Sir," she gasped, her voice pitched higher than anyone had ever heard it. "They've been telephoning all evening. Your cousins, your uncle from Cork, the solicitors, they know what you're planning. They're saying they'll never let you go through with this." The air in the mansion felt like a courtroom. Family members and advisors of Cormac packed the main salon, demanding explanations. The millionaire, once a man of stone and ice, now stood like someone prepared to lose everything to save only his dignity. Louisa watched in silence, crushed by the fear of being dragged into the whirlwind of accusations. They had arrived like carrion birds, sensing death Uncle Seamus from Cork with his bombastic voice and red-faced bluster, Cousin Margaret from Galway with her sharp tongue and sharper accounting mind, and the family solicitor, Mr. Whitman, whose expensive suit couldn't hide the sweat stains under his arms. The mansion's grand salon, usually a showcase of Tierney wealth and taste, had been transformed into an arena where decades of family politics were about to explode into the open. The crystal chandelier cast prismatic light across faces twisted with anger and greed. These were people who had lived comfortable lives on the periphery of Cormac's fortune, content to benefit from the family name whilst maintaining careful distance from its more complicated realities. But a donation of this magnitude, millions of pounds, that could have been their inheritance, had brought them swarming back like wasps disturbed from their nest. "Have you completely lost your mind?" Cormac Uncle Seamus bellowed, his Cork accent thick with indignation. "A hospital in Galway in her name? Do you have any idea what questions this will raise? What people will start asking about things that should stay buried? Cousin Margaret," a thin woman with steel gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features, clutched her handbag like a weapon. "The family has worked for generations to build our reputation. Our grandfather would be spinning in his grave if he knew you were about to destroy everything for some sentimental nonsense about the past." Mr. Whitman, trying to maintain professional composure whilst clearly panicking about the legal implications, shuffled through papers with trembling hands. "There are procedures for donations of this size, Cormac. Reviews, investigations, publicity that none of us want. We can find other ways to handle your guilt without exposing the family to scrutiny." But Cormac stood firm in the center of the storm, his tall frame straight as a ship's mast in a hurricane. His silver hair caught the light from the chandelier, and for the first time in decades, his steel-gray eyes held not coldness but fire. The expensive suit that had always been his armor now seemed like a costume he was ready to shed. Louisa pressed herself into the corner of the room, trying to become invisible whilst holding Sophia close. The child seemed to sense the tension, but not understand its source, her wide eyes taking in the adult drama with the fascination that children have for things they don't yet comprehend. Every harsh word thrown at Cormac felt like a blow aimed at her, as well she was, after all, the catalyst that had brought this all into the open. The argument raged for nearly an hour, voices rising and falling like waves against a cliff. Accusations flew about family loyalty, financial responsibility, and the sanctity of keeping old secrets buried. But then, in the midst of all this adult fury and fear, something extraordinary happened. Sophia, perhaps overwhelmed by the shouting, or simply bored by conversations she couldn't follow, wandered over to the grand piano that dominated one corner of the salon. It was a magnificent instrument, a Steinway that had been in the family for 3 generations, its ebony surface polished to mirror brightness. Without asking permission or seeming to consider the appropriateness of the moment, she climbed onto the bench and began pressing keys. The notes that emerged were simple, hesitant, the musical explorations of a child who had no formal training, but an instinctive feel for melody. But slowly, something recognizable began to emerge, a traditional Irish air, ancient and haunting. The kind of tune that seemed to carry the sorrows and joys of generations in its simple progression. The effect on the room was instantaneous and devastating. Every voice fell silent as if someone had cast a spell. But Cormac's reaction was the most dramatic of all. He went rigid as carved stone, his face draining of all color, until he looked like a man who had seen his own ghost walking. It was the melody that Ethan used to play as a child, sitting at this very piano during family gatherings. She had learned it from their grandmother, who had learned it from her grandmother before her. A chain of musical memory, stretching back through generations of Irish women. But Sophia had never heard this tune before, had never been taught these particular notes. Yet her small fingers found them with the certainty of inherited knowledge. The weight of this impossible moment crashed down on everyone present. Here was a child who somehow knew things she couldn't possibly know, who carried memories that weren't her own, who had become a living bridge between the buried past and the unforgiving present. Cormac, the man who had ruled his world through fear and financial power, fell to his knees beside the piano bench. His expensive suit crumpled against the Persian carpet, and his steel-gray eyes filled with tears that had been held back for decades. The family members who had come to browbeat him into submission now stood frozen, watching their patriarch crumble before a child's innocent music. His voice, when he finally found it, carried the weight of decades of buried grief. The truth is my inheritance, and you will not bury it again. But before he could finish explaining what that truth entailed, Uncle Seamus slammed his meaty fist down on the mahogany side table, causing a crystal vase to jump and rattle. "Then tell us publicly," he snarled, his face purple with rage and desperation. "Tell everyone exactly what happened to Ethan. Let's see how brave you really are when the whole world is watching." The salon waited in suspended silence. Cormac drew a deep breath, facing the relatives who had carried decades of privilege sustained by lies. His voice emerged grave and wounded, but unshakable. Ethan died because she wasn't given medical help in time. And I kept the silence that was imposed on me. No more. The words fell like hailstones, shattering glass windows. The revelation hit each family member differently. Uncle Seamus's face went from purple rage to ashen shock. Cousin Margaret clutched her pearls as if they could somehow anchor her to a world that was rapidly dissolving. And Mr. Whitman began frantically scribbling notes as if he could somehow contain the legal implications of what was being confessed. But Cormac wasn't finished. The dam had finally burst, and decades of suppressed truth came pouring out like water, breaking through a cracked wall. She was 19 years old. He continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, pregnant and frightened, begging to be taken to hospital when the complications started. But father was more concerned about scandal than his daughter's life. "We handle these things privately," he said. "The family reputation must be protected." So we kept her at home whilst she died slowly, in agony, calling for help that never came. The silence that followed was so complete that they could hear the ancient clock in the hallway ticking away the seconds, each tick like a nail, being driven into the coffin of family lies. Cousin Margaret began to weep not pretty tears of ladylike sorrow, but the ugly, wrenching sobs of someone whose entire worldview has collapsed. "The baby died with her," Cormac pressed on, his steel-gray eyes fixed on each family member in turn. "A little girl who might have grown up to play piano like Sophia, who might have brought joy instead of secrets to this house. But we buried them both, and then buried the truth with them. We paid off the coroner, altered medical records, and created a story about a car accident that never happened. Uncle Seamus made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Even if that's true, it was 47 years ago. What good does dragging it up now do for anyone? The dead are dead, boy. Don't destroy the living for the sake of ghosts." But Cormac was looking at Sophia, who had stopped playing piano and was now sitting quietly on the bench, her innocent eyes reflecting the chandelier light like stars. In her face, he saw not just the child she was, but the woman Eve might have become, the granddaughter who might have sat at this same piano learning these same ancient melodies. "Because," he said quietly, "I want to be remembered as more than just a man of stone. I want there to be one thing in my life that chose truth over comfort, justice over convenience." The family members began leaving one by one, their fury giving way to the cold calculation of damage control. They would have to reassess their positions, protect their own interests, distance themselves from the coming scandal. Uncle Seamus stormed out first, muttering threats about cutting all ties. Cousin Margaret followed, her sobs echoing through the corridors Dartmoor. Whitman gathered his papers with the grim efficiency of a man, preparing for a very complicated legal battle. When the salon finally emptied, only 3 people remained: Cormac, Louisa, and Sophia. The chandelier continued to cast its prismatic light, but somehow the room felt larger, as if the absence of lies had created more space for truth to breathe. Cormac, exhausted from decades of carrying secrets, turned to Louisa with eyes that held a peace she had never seen there before. "I don't want to replace what I lost," he said simply, "but I want people to remember that I wasn't always made of stone. That in the end, when it mattered most, I chose to be human." Louisa wept in silence, not for the drama they had all endured, but for the profound courage it had taken for this proud, damaged man to choose truth over everything else he had built his life around. She understood now that wealth and power were just elaborate costumes, and that underneath them, Cormac Tierney was simply a brother who had spent 47 years grieving for a sister. He couldn't save Sophia, understanding more than anyone expected her to. Simply walked over to Cormac and wrapped her small arms around him in a hug that contained no judgment, no fear, no calculation, just the pure acceptance that children offer when adults finally stop pretending to be perfect. In that gesture of innocent affection, there was more truth than in any of the grand speeches or dramatic revelations that had preceded it. The man who had been feared throughout Dalkey for his coldness and power had found his redemption, not in grand gestures or public acclaim, but in the simple courage to tell the truth when it would have been easier to keep lying. And as the three of them stood together in the mansion that had kept secrets for too long, the Irish wind outside seemed to blow a little cleaner, carrying away some of the staleness of old lies and bringing in the fresh possibility of honest tomorrows.